Let's get going with the second meta principle. So, by the way, guys, if you guys are wondering what about the position I have over here, it's not related to the meta principle, it's just a picturesque position, and I've linked to it in the description. Okay, so some principles are more important than others. This is something we've touched upon in the first meta principles video. So, I have a grading system to explain the frequency of the exceptions as well as the importance of the principle. I created a grading system listed under the importance of the principle. Now again, the subsection, the importance of the principle, it's not included in the meta principles section because all meta principles are important. But you'll get to see this section in other principles. So the grading system gives a grade on a scale from 1 to 10 for the principle according to how many exceptions to the principle there are. And another grade on a scale from 1 to 10 according to how the principle fits in with other principles, how important it is, and how bad it would be if it is violated. This division I came up with independently, but I soon learned that an Dan Heisman has actually come up with a very similar system. He uses the term strong principle, which means the principle has few exceptions, and important principle, which means the violation of the principle would lead to disastrous consequences. So I'm very happy that I came up with a system independently that's very similar or basically the same as Dan Heisman's system, and I'm very happy to share something with such a great mind as Dan Heisman. So let's take an example. Develop all your pieces in the opening. Now this principle has very few exceptions, I would say. Some might disagree here, but I think all of the exceptions to this principle can be lumped under the category of tactics or concrete things. So these concrete things, these are exceptions to all principles. So it would not make much sense if the scale I have from 1 to 10, it would not be possible to get a 10 out of 10 on the exception scale, because then all principles would have exceptions. Because remember, the concrete is more important than principles. This is something we talked about in principles in the meta principle number 1. So when you have something concrete, a tactic, you don't apply principles. The specific tactic takes precedence over the principle. When you have a checkmate in 2 moves, you're not going to think, oh yeah, let's make use of a good knight versus bad bishop situation. I keep coming back to that example. So tactics take precedence. And because they take precedence, this means that there are always exceptions to principles. So I thought it would not make much sense if I always mentioned these exceptions to the principles. So just take it for granted. There are always exceptions to the principles. And this opening principle, develop all your pieces, the only exceptions to this principle, I believe, are such exceptions, tactical in nature. So I would give it a 10 out of 10 in terms of the exception scale or exception scale. Remember that the exception scale is a reverse scale. So 10 out of 10 would mean that there are basically no exceptions to this, we could say, rule. It's more of a principle. So that's it for the exception scale. Now in terms of its importance, the principle should almost never be violated, but sometimes it should be violated. Like when you're at king safety is more important than this principle. So if your opponent has bad king safety and you can checkmate him in 2 moves, you're not going to develop one more piece and not checkmate him in 2 moves. That doesn't make any sense. So of course, in terms of its importance, that would be about an 8 out of 10. Because others are more important, but 8 out of 10 means it's very, very important. And so that's it for this principle, develop all your pieces. This is one example. I'll give you another example. A knight on the rim is dim. In ancient times, a few exceptions to this rule would not be found. There would be very few exceptions to this rule. But nowadays you can find many exceptions to this rule with modern day chess. That's one of the rules that are getting broken, or principle. But still, I would not say that they are very numerous. So I would give it like a 6 out of 10 in terms of the exception scale. There are quite a bit of exceptions, but not too much. And in terms of its importance, I wouldn't give it too big of an importance. Probably something about a 4 out of 10. If you put a knight on the rim, it's not going to lose you the game immediately, but if you don't develop your pieces, it probably will lose you the game immediately. So that's another example. And one more thing, it's important to again use this grading system to know how to differentiate principles in terms of their importance. So that helps you know when to apply principles, how you can mix principles together, how they can be separated, and yeah, that's basically it. But unfortunately, even with the grading system, certain peculiarities of a specific position might make one principle more important than the other, even though said principle might be more important on the scale I give you. So as stated in the introduction, I try to make a sea out of the ocean. So I try to make the ocean a sea, but the sea is still quite deep. So yeah, that's a big issue here. But hey, we're trying to make this easier. We're trying to make chess easier. So let's move on to the famous game. Alright, so for the famous game, this game obviously includes famous players. So let's start off. Jack Mises against Emanuel Lasker, both very famous players, of course. Emanuel Lasker, world champion, complete genius, friend of Einstein. Okay, so a rather normalish opening at the start, but knight c3 kind of a bit rare nowadays. Putting the knight here, usually knight f3 is played to put pressure on the pawn. Okay, so bishop c5. g3 is also a bit weird, wasting time to fianchetto the bishop. That is done, and d6 and knight a4. So let's take a look at this principle, right? So it basically breaks two principles. The first of which, of course, is that move every piece once before you move every piece twice. That's a rule of the opening. So you want to develop all your pieces so you don't move the same piece twice. This move does move the same piece twice. And also, a knight on the rim is dim. This is breaking this principle, right? Okay, so that's 0-2, 0-2. So it's breaking two principles. However, white also seeks to win the bishop pair. And the bishop pair on average is worth plus 0.5. This is another principle. So it's correctly applying one principle. So it's breaking two principles on one hand, but applying one principle on the other hand. But notice that there is no immediate tactical move to make use of white's knight a4. The piece is not going to be won anytime soon. And the bishop pair is a long-term advantage. So white is trading perhaps a short-term advantage for a long-term one, which is another principle. So white's move must not be that bad, right? Even though it's breaking two principles. For the following reasons I mentioned, it's really not that bad. However, it would have been probably better to simply develop a piece, to be honest. But in this game, actually, this happened. Emanuel Lasker was able to exploit white's time loss by developing his pieces and actually won the game. But the opening may be slightly to blame because he went for this knight a4 excursion. And to counteract this loss of the bishop pair, black played really quickly. He was able to win the game. And so for that reason, the game was won because white wasted time. But it's not such a big deal currently in the position, but you have to follow up correctly. So some principles are more important than others. That's this game clearly shows it. You have these two principles on one hand and the other principle on the other. But move every piece once before you move every piece twice. That's a very important principle. It basically means develop all your pieces in the opening. That's a very, very important principle. Breaking a knight on the rim is dim is not that important. And winning the bishop pair, it pales in comparison to the principle of develop all your pieces. So while technically this position is not so bad for white, it is not the best way to play. I'm pretty darn sure about that. And in a practical sense, it's rather bad because you're going to be facing an onslaught by black. So develop all your pieces, you broke that, instead you went for take the bishop pair. Now taking the bishop pair is of less importance compared to develop all your pieces, so that is why this game was lost by white. Hey guys, so let's move on with the other games section. This other game is actually a famous game. It includes Dan Heisman, he's famous. But we had to put this in the other game section because, we had one with Lasker in the famous games section. Okay, so let's see. Heisman, even as a 1600, he plays really brilliantly, applies the principles, he plays a funny gambit, it transposes to a French, and then with this check, he kind of stifles black's development, makes it a bit weird. He wins the pawn here, and now let's start. So here, white moves a piece twice, but also attacks a piece and develops with tempo. So what does this mean? That moving the same piece twice is less important than attacking the piece and gaining a tempo. Now, so these are usually given as of equal importance, but in this specific case, it's more important. So bishop d6, again he moves a piece, but notice he's gaining time, he's threatening to take. So white moves the knight a third time, but he's threatening something. Queen has to defend, the knight goes out, develop all your pieces, h6, that's a weird move, that's a waste of time. He wants to prevent knight g5, I get it, but nah. Black's position is already horrendous. And now he moves the piece a fourth time. However, there is a more important principle than move every piece once before you move every piece twice. That principle is a king in the center is a signal to attack. So white dutifully makes use of that principle. So that principle is more important, king safety. So he attacks. And just watch how Dan Heisman he destroys his opponent's king. Even at when he started chess, when he was 1600, he just destroyed him. Look at this. So he plays this, king f8, getting out of the pin. He takes the bishop. Okay, and now he castles. That's an important move. Castling is an attacking move. Now he has these ideas and his king is safe. The rook can join the fray. So the rook comes here, and now bishop e3. We have the semblance of this idea. And actually, soon enough, c3, okay, kind of playing a bit of tickle, and now this lines up this tactic, and this is what we're going to see. Black is oblivious. Already, I mean, even if g5, we have this tactic. It's a beautiful tactic, right? So here, and check. Of course, if the king moves, we just take the rook. And if the rook retreats here, we have this, and then we probably pick up the rook or do something else. Add pressure to the pinned piece. That's one principle. Yeah, so he plays g5, and now this happens. And he doesn't even bother to play rook e7. And the rest is a matter of technique, but this time technique is very easy. You're simply up a billion pieces. Yeah, that's it for this video, guys. Hope you got something out of it. And yeah, it's a very interesting video, a very important one, because some principles are more important than others. You have to know how to combine the principles. So I hope I could help you with that. Alright guys, take care.